3 days ago, someone sent me trail camera footage that I probably shouldn't be showing you. The person who sent it begged me not to share their location, not to use their name, and honestly, you can see why. This footage shows something standing 10 feet from a camera in a national forest in Idaho. Something massive, something covered in fur. And here's the part that's kept me awake for 3 nights straight. It's not running away from the camera. It's not hiding. It's standing there facing the camera directly with one hand raised in the air. Like it's waving, like it knows exactly what a trail camera is and decided to say hello. This thing wanted to be photographed. It wanted us to know it exists. And that's what terrifies me most. Because if something this intelligent has been hiding in our forests for centuries, and it's suddenly ready to be seen, we need to ask ourselves, what changed? What does it want? And what happens next? The person who sent this wants to remain anonymous, obviously, but they included a long email detailing 2 years of encounters with this creature near their mountain cabin in northern Idaho. I'm going to share their story with you today exactly as they told it, and I'll throw in my own thoughts along the way. But first, let's look again at the footage. The figure in this footage stands somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. I can estimate this based on the trees and brush in the background, and trust me, it's massive. The entire body is covered in thick, grayish-brown fur that looks matted and dirty, like something that lives outside year-round in harsh conditions. The fur appears lighter on the chest area and darker along the arms and head. This isn't some costume you buy at a Halloween store. The texture and the way it hangs on the body looks completely natural. The body structure is what really gets me. The shoulders are enormous, far broader than any human, built like something that could push through trees without slowing down. The chest is barrel-shaped and powerful. The legs are thick and muscular, bent slightly at the knees in a natural standing position. This thing has to weigh at least 500 pounds, maybe more. The face is mostly obscured by fur, but there's definitely something humanoid about it. It's not a bear. Anyone who's seen a bear standing upright knows they don't look like this. Bears have snouts, they have a different posture, they have that recognizable bear shape. This doesn't have any of that. What's most incredible is the hand. The right hand is raised up, clearly visible in the frame, and you can count 5 distinct fingers. The hand position looks like a person waving hello or maybe signaling stop. It's not a threatening gesture, it's not aggressive. It looks almost friendly or at least curious. The fingers appear long and the hand seems proportionally large, but the structure is unmistakably hand-like with an opposable thumb. The posture tells you everything you need to know about this creature's comfort level. It's standing there completely relaxed, not startled, not mid-stride like it was caught by accident. Now let me share what the person who sent this told me about how they ended up with this footage in the first place. According to the email, this person owns a small mountain cabin in northern Idaho, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The only way to get there is a rough logging road that turns into a nightmare in winter. They use the cabin as a retreat, a place to get away from everything, and like a lot of people with remote property, they set up trail cameras to monitor wildlife and make sure nobody's trespassing. The reason they put up the cameras in the first place, though, wasn't just for fun. About 2 years ago, during early spring when the snow was melting, they started noticing strange signs around the property. The first thing they found was massive footprints in the mud near a creek that runs through the property. These weren't bear prints or elk tracks or anything they recognized. These were barefoot prints, human-shaped, but way too big, nearly 18 inches long. The spacing and the depth suggested something incredibly heavy walking on 2 legs. They also found trees with bark stripped off, at heights no bear could reach. Black bears will mark trees and sometimes strip bark when they feed. But this was different. The marks were high up, 7 or 8 feet off the ground, and the bark had been peeled away in long strips like something with hands had done it. They thought maybe someone was camping illegally on the property, maybe some survivalist or homeless person living in the woods. Or maybe a bear with unusual behavior, though the footprints didn't match that theory at all. The footprints were what really bothered them. They took photos and even called a local wildlife officer to take a look. The officer glanced at the photos and said it was probably just a large bear print that got distorted by melting snow, stretched out and changed shape as the snow turned to slush. But anyone looking at those prints could tell they weren't bear prints. They were too symmetrical, too human-like in shape. Bear paws have a completely different structure with visible claws and pad patterns. These look like enormous human footprints. So they decided to set up trail cameras, 3 of them total. One camera went by the creek where the prints had appeared, another went on the main trail leading to the cabin, and the third went near the woodpile, because that's another place where strange things had been happening. Firewood that was stacked neatly would be found scattered in the morning, not knocked over by wind or animals, but deliberately unstacked and rearranged. Sometimes pieces would be placed in odd patterns. They thought maybe raccoons or something, but it didn't make sense. The cameras were set to motion activation, and they checked them about once a month, downloading the footage to see what wildlife was moving through. For months, the cameras captured the usual stuff: deer, elk, a black bear, foxes, raccoons, normal forest activity, nothing unusual. But they kept finding those signs around the property: more footprints, more disturbed firewood. And then the encounters started. The first real sighting happened 2 years ago on a cold April evening right around dusk. They were out behind the cabin splitting firewood about 30 yards from the tree line. It was one of those clear, quiet evenings where sound carries and you can hear every bird and every branch moving in the wind. They heard something that made them stop mid-swing. A loud crack, like a thick tree branch snapping under weight. Not the kind of sound a deer makes, something heavy. They looked toward the sound and saw movement in the shadows between the pine trees. Something huge was standing there, partially hidden behind a large Douglas fir. At first, they thought maybe a bear had wandered close to the cabin, which isn't that unusual in that part of Idaho. But as their eyes adjusted to the low light, they realized this wasn't a bear. The shape was wrong. It was standing fully upright, not hunched over like a bear does when it rears up on its hind legs. This was standing straight up like a person, but way too tall and way too broad to be human. They could only see the outline because of the shadows and the fading light. Tall, broad-shouldered, definitely not the rounded, compact shape of a bear. They stood there frozen, watching it. The figure didn't move for maybe 20 seconds, just stood there, maybe watching them back. Then it stepped backwards deeper into the forest and disappeared. Not running, not crashing through the brush. Just a smooth, deliberate retreat back into the trees. They tried to follow the tracks, but the forest floor was mostly dry needles and rocks, not much to leave prints in. They did find one clear footprint in a patch of soft ground near where the figure had been standing. Same as the prints from earlier, massive, human-shaped, about 18 inches long with 5 distinct toes. Whatever had been watching them from the tree line was the same thing that had been leaving prints around the property. They spent that night lying awake in the cabin, listening to every sound outside, trying to convince themselves it was just a bear. But they knew it wasn't. Sleep didn't come easy. They didn't tell anyone about it because, honestly, who would believe it? Even they were trying not to believe it. Maybe it was a bear and the low light just made it look weird. Maybe stress and imagination filled in the gaps. But deep down, they knew something else was out there. 3 months later in July, they had their second sighting. This one was much clearer. They were fishing at the creek about a quarter mile from the cabin. It was evening again, the sun setting and creating those long golden shadows through the trees that make everything look peaceful and beautiful. Perfect evening for catching trout. They heard splashing upstream and figured it was a deer or maybe an elk coming down to drink. Wildlife always comes to water at dusk, but when they looked up to see what it was, their blood went cold. The same massive figure from April was crouched by the water about 50 yards upstream, drinking, not lapping water like a bear. It was using cupped hands, bringing water to its mouth like a person would. This time they got a much better look because the light was better and the creature was out in the open by the creek. The fur was dark brown, almost black where it was wet from the water. There were lighter patches on the shoulders. The head had a conical shape, tapering up from a thick neck, or actually no visible neck at all. The face was pushed forward, somewhere between ape-like and human-like. It was like looking at something that didn't fit into any category they knew. They froze completely, didn't move a muscle, didn't even breathe. Just watched this thing drinking from the creek with its hands. Then the creature suddenly looked up directly at them, eye contact across the creek. The eyes reflected the sunset light like an animal's eyes do, that eye shine you see in deer and raccoons at night. They stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it stood up, full height, easily 8 feet tall, massive. It made a sound they'd never heard before. Not a roar, not exactly a grunt, somewhere in between. A low, rumbling vocalization that they felt vibrating in their chest more than heard with their ears. It was a sound that said, "I see you, I'm bigger than you, and you should probably back off." The creature slowly backed away into the tree line, never taking its eyes off them. It didn't run, didn't panic, just calmly retreated back into the forest and disappeared. They stood there by the creek, heart pounding so hard they thought they might pass out. The fishing rod fell from their hands. They somehow made it back to the cabin, locked all the doors, and spent another sleepless night listening to every sound outside. That was when they knew for certain this was real. This was something living on their property or nearby. Something that came to the creek to drink. Something big and aware and intelligent enough to make eye contact and assess whether they were a threat before deciding to leave. After that July encounter at the creek, strange things around the cabin started happening more frequently. The most consistent thing was the firewood. They'd stack it neatly by the side of the cabin, organized by size, ready for the wood stove. But they'd wake up in the morning and find it scattered, not knocked over by wind or animals. The pieces were deliberately unstacked and sometimes placed in odd patterns. Logs arranged in circles, smaller pieces balanced on top of larger ones. It was methodical. Then the offering started appearing. They'd find things left on top of the woodpile, pine cones arranged in perfect circles, smooth river rocks stacked into little cairns. Once they found a deer antler placed carefully right on top of the wood stack. These weren't random. You could tell something was trying to communicate, or maybe leaving gifts. The patterns were too deliberate to be coincidence or animal activity. At first they wondered if maybe local kids were coming up to the property and pulling pranks. But the cabin is way too remote for that. There are no other houses nearby. The logging road is rough and muddy, and there were never any vehicle tracks. Plus, no human footprints. Only those massive barefoot prints showing up occasionally in soft ground around the woodpile area. The pattern continued through fall and into winter, becoming more frequent as the weather got colder. One morning they found an entire rabbit carcass placed on a flat rock near the woodpile. The rabbit had been killed cleanly, not torn apart, not eaten, just placed there like an offering. They didn't know what to make of it. Was it a gift? A warning? Was this thing trying to show it could hunt? Or was it simple curiosity, leaving things for the humans the same way the humans were leaving things by existing there? The meaning was unclear, but the intention was obvious. Something was interacting with them. Something was aware of their presence and was responding to it in some way. That was both fascinating and terrifying. January brought heavy snow, and they got snowed in at the cabin for 3 days during a major storm. Roads were impassable. Power went out. It was just them, the wood stove, and the howling wind. On the second night, around 2 a.m, they heard something on the porch. Heavy footsteps, not the light pattering of a deer or the scrambling of a raccoon. These were deliberate, measured steps, something heavy walking on 2 legs. They lay in bed, frozen, listening. The footsteps moved across the porch, slow and steady. Then they heard it stop right outside the bedroom window. They could hear breathing, slow, deep breaths. Then they saw something that made their blood run cold. The window started to fog up from the outside. Something was breathing on the glass, face close enough to leave condensation. They backed away from the window and grabbed the rifle they keep above the fireplace. By the time they worked up the courage to look outside again, whatever it was had gone. But in the morning, when the storm cleared a bit, they found tracks in the fresh snow, the same massive footprints leading from the tree line straight to the porch, then circling the entire cabin, every window, every door, like it was checking the whole place out. Then the tracks led back into the forest. Each print was crystal clear and perfect in the untouched snow, 5 toes clearly visible, deep impressions showing weight distribution. The stride length was nearly 6 feet between steps, longer than any human could manage. Whatever made those tracks weighed at least 500 pounds and walked exclusively on 2 legs. This wasn't a bear that occasionally stands upright. This was something that walked like a human with a bipedal gait, but was twice the size. When spring arrived and the snow melted, they started exploring the property more thoroughly, following the directions the tracks always led. About half a mile from the cabin, up a slope in a dense stand of pines, they found something that made everything click into place. A shelter, not a natural formation. This was constructed. Branches had been woven together into a crude lean-to, big enough for something huge to sleep under. The construction was rough but effective, using thick branches broken from nearby trees and arranged to shed rain. Inside the shelter was a depression in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, lined with pine needles and moss, like a giant nest. The bedding material looked recently used, not dried out or decomposed. They found tufts of dark brown fur caught on the rough bark of the branches, coarse hair about 3 inches long. They also found what looked like a food cache nearby, bones from deer and elk, completely cleaned of meat, arranged in a neat pile with flat rocks placed over them. This was food storage, planning ahead, intelligence. They took photos of everything but didn't disturb the site. This was clearly a living space, used regularly, maintained. The creature had been living here for who knows how long, maybe years, well before they ever bought the cabin. This was its territory first, and it had been watching the cabin all this time, observing the new neighbors. That realization was unsettling but also gave them some comfort. If it wanted to hurt them, it had plenty of opportunities. It knew where they slept. It had stood outside their window, but it hadn't tried to break in or cause harm. It just watched and rearranged firewood. Most of the encounters had been at dawn, dusk, or in the middle of the night. Low light conditions where it's hard to see clearly and easy to question what you saw. But one sunny afternoon in June, that all changed. They were hiking a ridge trail about 2 miles from the cabin, just enjoying the clear weather and mountain views. Nothing special planned, just a nice day to be outside. They stopped to rest on a rock outcrop that overlooked a small valley below. Beautiful spot. You could see for miles. They were drinking water and catching their breath when movement caught their eye down in the valley. Something large was crossing an open meadow. They pulled out their binoculars to get a better look, thinking it might be an elk or maybe a bear. What they saw through those binoculars made their hands shake. The creature was walking fully upright through the meadow, arms swinging naturally at its sides like a person walking. But the gait was different, more fluid. The stride was long and the movement was effortless, like something perfectly adapted to covering ground on two legs. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick brown fur that was lighter on the chest and darker on the limbs. They watched for nearly 5 minutes as it crossed the meadow. It stopped once to look at something on the ground, bending down to examine it. Then it continued walking and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. Full daylight, clear view, no question about what they were seeing. This was the longest, clearest sighting yet, and there was no way to explain it away. No trick of the light, no misidentified bear. This was something real, something living in these mountains, something that by all conventional understanding shouldn't exist. That sighting changed everything. Up until then, there was still some room for doubt. Maybe it was all misidentifications or imagination. But watching that creature walk across an open meadow in broad daylight for 5 full minutes removed all doubt. This was real. Okay, let me jump in here with my own thoughts, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Looking at everything this person described over 2 years, you can see clear patterns in the creature's behavior. This wasn't random. This wasn't a monster stalking prey. This was an intelligent being with its own routines and territory, and it was curious about the humans who had moved into its space. First, the creature seemed curious about humans, but not aggressive. Every encounter involved the creature observing, checking things out, maybe testing boundaries, but never attacking. When it made eye contact at the creek, it could have charged. It was bigger and stronger. Instead, it made a warning sound and left. That shows restraint. That shows intelligence and decision-making. Second, it avoided direct confrontation. It always kept distance. It appeared briefly and then retreated. The only time it came really close was at night when the person was inside and couldn't see it clearly. Even then, it didn't try to break in. It just looked through the window and walked around the cabin, almost like a security patrol, then left. It was checking on things but not threatening. Third, those offerings at the woodpile suggested real intelligence and maybe even a desire to communicate. Arranging pine cones in circles, stacking rocks, leaving an antler. These aren't random acts, these are deliberate placements. The creature was responding to human presence with its own form of interaction. Maybe it was saying, "I see you, I'm here too, and I'm not a threat." Or maybe it was just curious about these strange new neighbors. Fourth, it had clear routines, drinking at the creek at dawn, moving through certain areas at specific times. The winter tracks appearing more frequently around the cabin during the coldest months, like it was checking to see if anyone was home. These aren't mindless wanderings. This is an animal, or something close to an animal, managing its territory and resources intelligently. What really stands out to me is that there was never any sign it tried to break into the cabin or cause real harm beyond rearranging firewood. Think about that. This creature could easily tear that cabin apart if it wanted to. 8 feet tall, 500 pounds, incredibly strong. But it chose not to. It chose to coexist. That tells you everything about its nature. This wasn't a monster from horror stories. This was a living being with intelligence, caution, and maybe even some level of social awareness. So I got curious after reading this email and started doing some research on my own. I wanted to know if there were any historical accounts or legends from that part of Idaho about creatures like this. And what I found was fascinating. The Nez Perce and Coeur d'Alene tribes, who have lived in that region for thousands of years, both have stories about forest giants that lived in the deep mountains. These beings go by different names depending on which tribe and which era, but the descriptions are remarkably consistent. Some translations call them wild men, others call them hairy walkers or elder brothers. The old stories describe them as guardians of the forest, shy but extremely powerful, with deep wisdom about the mountains and the land. They were said to help lost travelers sometimes, leading them to water sources or leaving food near their camps. But they were also described as capable of great anger if they were disrespected or hunted. One legend tells of hunters who cornered one of these beings in a canyon, and it threw boulders down at them from above, killing 2 men before escaping deeper into the mountains. Another story describes how they would steal food from hunting camps but never hurt anyone. They'd take what they needed and leave behind only their massive footprints as evidence. The tribal elders warned early settlers to respect these beings, never to hunt them or try to drive them away, because they were part of the land itself. They belonged here long before humans arrived, and they would be here long after humans left. What struck me most was how perfectly the behavior described in these old legends matched what this person was experiencing. The curiosity but caution, the offerings left behind, the nighttime visits, the awareness of humans but unwillingness to make direct contact. The indigenous people of that region knew about these creatures and built their relationship with the land around respecting them and leaving them alone. That knowledge was passed down for generations, and then settlers arrived and dismissed it all as superstition and myth. But maybe it wasn't myth at all. Back to the email. The person said that by late summer of the 2nd year, the encounters became more frequent. It was like the creature was getting more comfortable with their presence, or maybe it had decided they weren't a threat. They saw it at the creek at dawn several times, always at the same spot, always alone. Once it saw them watching from the cabin window and didn't run. It just stood there for a moment, looked directly at them, then went back to drinking. That kind of casual acknowledgement felt significant, like they'd established some kind of understanding. They'd also find fresh tracks on the trail leading to the cabin, still damp from morning dew, meaning the creature had passed by less than an hour before they walked the same trail. The tracks were everywhere, by the creek, on the trails, near the woodpile, even on the porch steps sometimes. It was like the creature was becoming bolder, less worried about leaving evidence of its presence. The offerings on the woodpile continued. More pine cones in circles, more rocks. Once they found a perfect circle of white quartz stones about 3 feet across, each stone carefully placed. The precision was incredible. That kind of pattern making shows advanced cognitive function, problem solving, planning, artistic expression maybe. This wasn't just an animal following instinct. This was something creating for the sake of creating. Around this time, they decided to leave offerings of their own. They started putting things out deliberately, apples from the cabin, beef jerky. Once they left a bottle of water. Everything they'd left out was taken, always during the night, and always without any sound from inside the cabin. And something was always left in return. They'd find interesting rocks where the food had been, smooth river stones, quartz crystals. Once they found a fossil embedded in sandstone, like the creature had found something interesting and wanted to share it. In September, something extraordinary happened. They were sitting on the porch one evening at dusk, just reading and relaxing. They heard that familiar sound, a branch snapping in the tree line about 50 yards away. They looked up, and there it was, standing partially behind some trees, but clearly visible. This time, it didn't immediately retreat. For several minutes, they just watched each other. Neither moved. It was like both sides were waiting to see what the other would do. Then they did something that might have been stupid or might have been brilliant. They slowly raised one hand in a greeting gesture. Just a simple wave, not threatening, just acknowledging the creature's presence. They didn't really expect anything to happen, but after a long pause, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, the creature raised its own hand. Same gesture, deliberate and clear. A wave back. Then it turned and walked away, not running, not rushing, just walking calmly back into the forest like it had made its point and was satisfied. That moment changed everything. Up until then, there was still some possibility that this was just an animal with unusual behavior. But animals don't mimic human gestures. Animals don't understand waving. This was something aware, something intelligent enough to recognize a greeting and return it in kind. This was communication across species. The person said they felt both exhilarated and terrified in that moment. Exhilarated because they had just communicated with something science says doesn't exist. Terrified because if this thing was that intelligent and aware, what did it think about them? What did it want? And what would happen next? The email said that since they discovered the trail camera footage about 3 weeks ago, the activity has intensified significantly. The creature now appears at the woodpile almost every night. They can hear it moving around outside. Heavy footsteps on leaves and gravel, branches moving. Once they woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of it doing something with the firewood, restacking it or rearranging it. In the morning, they found the wood had been organized into neat rows, sorted by size, like the creature was helping out, or maybe just liked organizing things. Footprints are everywhere now, by the creek, on the trails, even on the porch steps. Multiple fresh prints every morning. The creature is no longer trying to hide its presence. It's like it knows it's been photographed and has decided there's no point in being secretive anymore. Or maybe it wants more interaction. Maybe seeing that camera and deliberately posing for it was its way of saying, I'm here, I see you, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. The person said it no longer feels threatening at all. Now it feels more like sharing space with a very unusual neighbor. Someone who lives nearby, has their own routines, occasionally stops by to check on things and rearrange the firewood. The encounters have gone from rare and terrifying to regular and almost comfortable. There's still distance between them, still boundaries being maintained, but the feeling has shifted from fear to coexistence. They've really committed to the gift exchange now. They're leaving better offerings deliberately. Fresh fish from the creek, bags of granola and trail mix, fruit, and everything is always taken without fail. And something is always left in return. The rocks have gotten more interesting, beautiful pieces of quartz, smooth river stones with unusual patterns. Once they found a fossil of a fern embedded in shale, probably millions of years old, carefully placed where they'd left food the night before. They also started finding more elaborate artistic arrangements, circles of pine cones with a single feather placed in the center. Stacks of flat rocks balanced perfectly, sometimes 5 or 6 high, which takes incredible patience and fine motor control. These arrangements show creativity, problem solving, and patience. This is real communication happening. A relationship developing across species. The creature is showing that it understands the exchange is reciprocal. Gift for gift, gesture for gesture, respect for respect. The most recent encounter happened just last week, according to the email, and it was the closest interaction yet. They were chopping firewood one evening as the sun was setting and shadows were getting long. They heard that familiar branch snap sound and looked up to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing. But this time it was much closer than ever before, maybe only 20 yards away. close enough to see real details. They didn't freeze this time, didn't feel afraid. They just stood there holding the axe, watching. The creature stood completely still, watching back. Then they slowly put down the axe and stepped back, showing they weren't a threat. The creature seemed to understand. It moved forward a few steps, still cautious but less hesitant than before. For the first time, they could see details that had been hidden before. Scars on the shoulders, probably from fights or accidents. Patches where the fur was matted and dirty. The rise and fall of its massive chest as it breathed, slow and steady. They could see its face more clearly too, still mostly covered in fur, but the eyes were visible. Dark eyes, very aware, watching and assessing. Intelligent eyes. The creature made a sound, not aggressive, more like a questioning grunt, a vocalization that seemed to ask, "What now?" They didn't know what to do, so they sat down on the ground, made themselves smaller, less threatening, showing submission maybe, or just showing they weren't going to do anything. And the creature sat too, cross-legged like a person would sit about 15 yards away. They just sat there together, human and creature in the fading light, neither moving, just being present with each other. After several minutes, the creature stood up, made another softer sound that almost seemed friendly, and walked back into the forest. That was it. No aggression, no fear. Just two intelligent beings sharing space for a few minutes before going their separate ways. The person said that was the moment they fully accepted what was happening. This wasn't just strange wildlife behavior. This was a relationship, an understanding, a connection. The email ended with some reflections that I think are worth sharing because they get to the heart of why this story matters. The person said that 3 months have passed since they first saw that trail camera footage. The creature remains in the area. They see it or hear it regularly now. They've stopped trying to explain it or justify it to themselves. This is simply the reality they live with now. They're sharing this mountain with something that science says doesn't exist, but absolutely does. They said the local legends were right all along. These beings are real. They're intelligent. They've been here for thousands of years, living in the deep mountains, watching humans from the shadows. They stay hidden not because they're primitive or stupid, but because they choose to. They've learned over centuries that humans can be dangerous, that humans destroy what they don't understand, that the best way to survive is to remain a mystery. But this one chose something different. It chose to reveal itself slowly and carefully over 2 years. It chose to build trust. It chose to communicate through gestures and gifts and shared moments. It chose to pose for that trail camera with its hand raised, acknowledging that yes, it exists, and yes, it sees you seeing it. The person hasn't told anyone else about this except me, and now you watching this video. They're not going public with their name or exact location. They're not seeking fame or trying to prove anything. Because they understand that if this becomes public knowledge, if researchers and hunters and tourists start flooding the area, the creature will disappear. The forest will get invaded. This remote canyon will turn into a circus. And the trust that was built over 2 years will be destroyed in a day. They said the creature is safe as long as it stays hidden, as long as most people think it's just stories and legends. The footage is proof, but sharing it widely would put the creature at risk. That's why they sent it to me anonymously. They wanted someone to know. They wanted it documented somewhere, but they also want this being protected. The person ended their email by saying that every time they look at that trail camera footage, seeing that raised hand, it reminds them that we share this world with more than we understand. There are still mysteries out there, still things that defy explanation, still beings that live just beyond the edge of what we think is possible. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Maybe some mysteries should stay mysterious. Maybe some beings deserve to remain unknown. Maybe the mountain is big enough for both species, and the best thing we can do is respect that space and let them be. I tend to agree. After reading this email and looking at this footage countless times, I'm convinced this is the real deal. This isn't a costume. This isn't a hoax. This is footage of something that shouldn't exist but does. Something intelligent and aware. Something that chose to acknowledge a camera, to wave at humanity, to say, I'm here, I see you, and I'm choosing to show myself. What you do with this information is up to you. Believe it or don't, share it or keep it to yourself. But look at that footage again. Look at that hand gesture. Look at the stance and the comfort level. Look at the details and ask yourself, what else is out there in the wilderness that we haven't found yet? What else is watching us from the trees? What else is leaving tracks that we explain away? What else is real that we've decided can't be real? Maybe the real question isn't whether Bigfoot exists. Maybe the question is whether we're ready to accept what it means if it does. Because if this creature is real, and if it's this intelligent and aware, then we need to completely rethink our relationship with the wild places. We need to understand that we're not alone out there. We never were. And maybe that's the most important lesson this trail camera footage has to teach us. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you've had your own encounter with something like this, I'd love to hear your story. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, but stay open to the possibility that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we've been taught to believe.